happened because there was a necessity for it to happen to make a living, to do that. There was never any of these inspired things, oh my God, you know, I discovered this pianist, blah, blah, blah. Never happened. I simply did all these things to make a living.
And how did you get to Belmont? How did you meet Jerry Warren?
Jerry Warren was on a Burl Red session singing backup harmony and voice. And that was in 78, 79. And he was among the vocalists that was doing these backup things. And
Jerry Warren ran the School of Music. He was the dean of the college, and he was interim president of Belmont for a while. So for those of you that are fairly new to Belmont, Jerry Warren's this giant figure here.
Well, Burl Red was out of New York, and he had an office up there. He was doing a lot of religious albums. But he also was doing it from a classical point of view. It wasn't like coming in and doing gospel stuff. It was very definitely, he went to the Yale School at one point. So he was very picky of who he had. And Jerry Warren was one of the people on there. And I think Jay Collins, who was here at that time, also was aware of that. And so in Belmont, this opening for the commercial music school was just starting. And Bob Malloy was here at that time. So he called me. He said, well, how would you like to teach at the Belmont College? You know? And I said, sure, I'd like to come over. And so I went over and we had our interview with Linda Ford and everybody else who was there in the room. And that's how that happened. I remember in the book, my wife, when she found out that I was finally going to use my degrees, because I had by that time had my master's and bachelor's back from the 50s, but I never used them. And she went out into the front yard and breathed a silent prayer of thanks. No more having to wait for the phone to ring, a steady paycheck, you know. And so that happened in 1980. And I was here at the very beginning of the commercial music idea of the commercial music program. I remember I was using that very thick blue book by Ewan. That was the book that we were using, and everybody had to get that thing. It's chock full of information. You have to go through it and pick things out here. You never read the whole thing. But anyway, now, after a certain period of time, I begged, borrowed, and stole to have at least 8 of those books put into the library much, much later, because you couldn't get anything better than that. Everything was there.
And do you remember the title of that book?
Years of commercial music. I don't know. I think is anybody have that title?
I've got it. I don't remember
It's,
the title, but
Okay.
I have this little copy of it.
Yeah.
But he taught history of commercial music
Yeah.
from 1980 to May of 2017. Every semester he taught that class.
I started to sort of bounce off of that book into a few other books at the time that were more timely. But you couldn't go wrong with the history in that one book. Everything was there. Dates, appearances. Gershwin appeared in Town Hall with Eva Gauthier, who was a vocalist at that time when he was very young.
When you started teaching here, you were still working in the studios?
Oh yeah, I never gave that up. And it started from there to going over to Europe. But I had already started doing that in the 70s. In 1969, Joe Habig from the Reader's Digest Club called me and wanted me to go to London to record Our Winter Love, because he was putting out an album called Cocktail Piano, which was going to be using other piano hits. In other words, Eddie Haywood's Canadian Sunset was one of them. And so we were all getting ready to go over and play in London, and all of a sudden the English Union decided, no, wait a minute, we've got pianists here in London that can do this. They missed the whole point. And so the English Union started to argue with the American Union, but the English Union won out. And so I went over anyway, but Ronnie Price was a pianist, a great renown over there, who was doing a lot of sessions, and Ronnie played Winter Love, and I went along as a kind of overseer or whatever you wanted to, but that gave me the taste of London. And at that time, your scale was something like 20 pounds and 23 pence for a whole session. And I came back and I told Bob McKenzie and a few of these other guys, I said, you can go over there and do a whole album for a fraction of what we're paying here. And that's what opened the door for a lot of people going over there. This was long before John Williams started going over there and recording The Empire Strikes Back and so forth. Because he was using the entire London Symphony Orchestra. You can imagine what the bill on that would be. And he was recording at Anvil Studio, where I was working with Kurt Kaiser of Word Records. And so that's how I came into being using the same engineer. Now this was in the 70s. So by the time I started teaching here, I was firmly entrenched in London, and so I continued to go over to London. But it got to be a headache because I had to cover my classes and make sure they were being taught, and at the same time catch up. When I came back, and finally I thought, well, this is probably more trouble than it's worth. And so I stopped going to London for those things so that I could teach full-time here.
And you did work with the Nashville Symphony too, right, through the 80s?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
It was a combination of Martha Ingram was asking me to do things. And then I had a commission from Aladdin, Victor Johnson, who wanted somebody to write a symphony to thank Nashville for all that it had done for Aladdin industry. You know, Aladdin had those little lunch pails that you would take to school that had all these little doodads on them. That was Aladdin.
Right? Yeah, okay.
And so Victor, who was the president, came to me and he commissioned me to do the symphony describing Nashville.
Mm-hmm.
So that led into a great deal of research in the public library. It's amazing when you get into these things, all these things start popping up that you never knew. For instance, I didn't realize that Nashville was such a documentedly kind of sophisticated city in those days. And one of the things I came across was a picture of a trolley car coming up West End Avenue in 1897. And that blew my mind because I love trolley cars. And going to school in San Francisco, and my mother was from San Francisco. So I grew up with streetcars, and I love them. I mean, ding, 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 and you get on them, and you know, just a... So
And
anyway,
back.
yeah. So here's this picture, and I thought, my God, I can't believe this. And I started doing some research and found out that this was a model system for Birmingham, that they started the trolley system down there. Well, that was the first movement. And all that research led into some historical stuff that was invaluable as far as I was concerned, to get that kind of a commission. And of course, the second one showed a wagon in 1897 or 1898, the very year that Brahms died. Am I right? 1898, I believe. Yeah, it was at that time, showing two girls in a festoon type of carriage with all these flowers in the wheels and even on the horses' bridle and everything, on their way to Centennial Park for the big Centennial celebration. And it was the same year that Brahms died. So yes, 1898. So I figured at that point, well, I'm going to describe that. But it kind of went into a little Brahms, you know, in the middle of it. And then it came back out. And then the third movement became 1864, Battle of Nashville. And it was a very important battle. Lincoln had decided, and Grant had decided, that if the general there wasn't going to get on it and do something, they were going to have to send another general down, which is what was happening. But they went to war before that actually happened. But Adelicia Ackland's it was mentioned at one point, smoke from the center of town, smoke being seen beyond Adelicia Ackland's mansion. And that would have been right at the area where I was living at that time on Curtiswood Lane. It was right there between Battery Lane, and so I was living on hallowed ground. So I decided to make that the movement of its description of carrying all the soldiers out after the battle itself. And then, of course, the fourth movement became the Ryman, because Colonel Tom Ryman built this thing for a guy named Sam Jones out of Cartersville, Georgia, who was a Methodist preacher who saved him. So he built the Ryman Auditorium, named the Ryman Auditorium. It was actually called the Gospel, it was called the Gospel.
Yeah, Tabernacle.
Yeah, Tabernacle. And that's why you can see those church pews in there today. And I thought that I wanted to describe Sam Jones preaching, you know, on the podium. You're doomed to perdition, you know, that kind of thing. So that's what that movement was about. So you had four movements, each of which to me were very educational to write. Because I learned so much information about this town. I came to the conclusion this town was quite sophisticated, you know? Much more than Tulare. You know, when I came here, I had no idea that there was this kind of history.
Not a history.
So it doesn't resemble anything now, but it kind of slowly made its way along in history. That's basically it.
All right. And one more hard question. What advice do you have about the music industry for our Belmont students?
Well, the music industry right now is so vastly different from what it used to be. It's not the same industry. I was never really in love with the Grand Ole Opry syndrome type of thing, but I certainly recorded it, and that is long gone. Country music is just a word now. It's basically, there's nothing that really resembles anything today in country music, except once in a while you have people coming in and out that have the lineage, have the background. The people I worked with in the 60s, I would say the 60s, and there's never been a good book written about the 60s here. Somebody is going to get on that one of these days and describe some of the things that happened. But it was during that particular time that all these other traumatic things happened, like the Patsy Cline crash and Jim Reeves and all that sort of thing. And Hank Garland, I'll never forget him. When I came here in 1961, I couldn't figure out what this guy was doing here, who came from a very country background, but was playing a lot like Tal Farlow, you know, the great jazz guitarist. And I played with Hank down on the alley at Jimmy High Supper Club. And he would kick off a tempo like that fast, and we would have to, follow him. And I would say, Hank, you can't swing that fast. There's no way. All you're doing is playing a line of notes. But he was that kind of an artist. He played on the Grand Ole Opry one afternoon. He did Mac the Knife. I'll never forget that. Got a tremendous ovation from a whole lot of people that didn't even understand what he was doing, But at the same time, Hank was probably one of the most original people, and gone. And he had a tragic automobile accident in '61 when he flew through the windshield, one car collision, landed on his head, and it sealed off everything that he could do. He's gone. And that's why I say somebody's going to write a book about the '60s, because there was a lot of things that happened in that frame of time.
What about, is there anything that a young musician can do? I mean, I know the recording industry is so different now, but if someone's trying to make it, what advice would you give them just as musicians? Maybe
In
not
order
even
to
as,
get into it,
or just preparing themselves to be a working musician, because I think some things don't change, right?
do a lot of listening.
A lot of listening.
Oh, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you finally meet these musicians, they're going to know what you've just picked up. So you better be able to do that. I mean, to be able to have your chops together on all those things. And they're quick to catch on. Especially considering the fact that they have worked in the studio, worked in the industry for so many years. You know, they go back in the 50s. Although that generation's gone now. But that goes back to the Hank Williams time in 1953. And I believe he died in 1953. I believe. On his way to some kind of music appointment, sitting up in the back seat of his car. They stopped at a service station. He had a driver, and he stopped at the service station. And the guy that was putting the gas in the car came back and said, "I think you better look back at the man in the back there. I think he's dead." And that was Hank Williams. That was when that happened. He just died, and he was taking amphetamines and all that sort of stuff, probably heart failure. And then, well, never mind, I should go on about that.
I have a question. So, Bill, how have you lived such a great life? I mean, you've talked about all these folks who had unfortunate endings, and here you are, this magnificent person with such a history. And by the way, we get to say that. How have you done this?
Well, I've never had any hang-ups
Right.
in terms of arbitraries or drinking or anything like that. I used to work out most of my life in the gym 3 times a week.
Wow.
And I started that when I was at Eastman, at the Y. I had come out of the service weighing 145 pounds in the lean. Burton looked at me and said, "Why are you so thin?" And I said, "I'm tired," because I had just come out of the service writing for a radio show for 2 years in Washington, D.C., called the Air Force Hour, for an orchestra that was about 55 people. By the way, so many people from that orchestra went into so many key positions. Bob Marcellus became the first clarinet player of the Cleveland Symphony under Zell. Johnny Schaefer, who played bass, worked under Bernstein in the New York Philharmonic. Edgar Munzer, who was a pal of mine, ended in the Chicago Symphony, worked there for 43 years under all the conductors. And so evidently this one orchestra was full of people who were simply biding their time to get their time in militarily so that they could go back to their position, that they had before. And I was luckily there to write for them. I mean, I had some great musicians to write for. And I was about 20, 21 at the time when I was doing this. And that's how I learned orchestration, by just getting him doing it. And it was that got me